Hello, welcome to History Laid Bare. I am the Bear. We're doing Bear on Tour. I went to the chapel of St Mary Magdalen recently in Ripon, also known as the Leper Chapel, and I thought I'd do a walkthrough, a little tour of the place because it's not very well known and I think more people need to see it. I am going to warn you, these videos and images aren't in super high def, 4K, 8K, high definition that you can see the moisture molecules. This channel doesn't make any money. So if you want that, go to another YouTuber. However, if you want my tour of it, stay. Let's start with purely a walkthrough of the chapel inside. Cue the music. Cue the heavenly vibe. Let's go. The first thing you get a sense of when you enter this chapel is its age. The stone flooring, the stone walls, the windows that are slightly crooked because they were all built by hand. This chapel has been here for hundreds upon hundreds of years. It has been here before Henry VIII, before Henry V. And if you are religious or spiritual, perhaps you'll get a sense of this building is not about grandeur. This isn't a cathedral built to the highest purity of beauty to reflect a divine. This chapel is simplicity. This chapel is echoing when Christ walked into the temple and threw the tables in the air. This is purity of faith. This is a house purely built for worship. Brief history of this building. It was built in the 12th century, and as I said, it is known as the Chapel of St Mary Magdalen or the Leper Chapel. Both names are rather misleading because what this chapel is a hospital chapel. There used to be hospital buildings nearby that catered to people who suffered from leprosy. Leprosy is and was a truly awful condition. It affects the skin, it affects the bone, it is very painful. You wouldn't want any condition or disease in the medieval era, but you especially wouldn't want leprosy. You were shunned, you were outcast, which means this hospital complex was perfectly situated because now where this chapel is, it's very much an urban area. It's very much a part of Ripon. However, back then, there was a distance between the hospital and Ripon, the city. So the people suffering from leprosy and the nuns and the monks looking after them would have been able to live in relatively peace and without disturbance. On screen right now is my attempt at making an AI rendering. Let's go with rendering of what it would have looked like back in the 12th century when it was active. So you can see that the buildings that served the lepers and people in need were away from the chapel, and you get an idea of where the chapel was situated. Why was the chapel so important? Well, back in the medieval era, faith and healthcare come hand in hand. You've got to pray to God for your recovery, but you've also got to rely on the nuns and monks who are looking after you. And if you are an inpatient back then, you were forced to attend Mass. Now, this leads us on to our first bit that I question. Now, I did my research for this by reading a book called Going to Church in Medieval England, which I highly recommend. But I also read the information that was available at the chapel itself. And it states in the information provided that the lower window on the north wall was used so lepers could see Mass happening. So you can view the altar via this window, but they could also receive communion via this window. I don't fully understand that, because if the monks and nuns were treating the lepers, why weren't they allowed to just attend Mass in the chapel? We're not talking about a time where COVID, where we had to enforce social distancing, that they were actively treating these people. This is something I believe we can thank our Victorian ancestors for. They believed these windows were used as leper windows, like I said, like the information at the chapel says. However, I think this was more to do with ventilation. That's the only purpose that they would serve. It's an interesting idea that these windows were used to have some separation between the healthy people and the lepers. But this is a chapel devoted to people who suffer from leprosy. So doesn't it defeat the point if they're not allowed in the chapel? Staying with this window, you'll see that there is a bell in a box. Why is this interesting? The bell's wooden. Yeah. So the story goes that some fun-loving lads climbed the church chapel back in the 18th century to ring the bell, only to discover the bell was wooden. Story goes that the Dean Woodalove, brilliant name, who was the master of the chapel at the time, had sold the bell in order to pay for drinks, the gambling debt, money, pick one. The story may or may not be true. It may be an attempt to understand why the bell was discovered to be wooden. A local historian in 1938, a Thomas Gouland, doubted the story, and it was more a suggestion of how the clergy were seen at the time. It was a reflection of the nation's values towards them. However, interesting story. I don't know why the bell was wooden. It makes sense. If you want to make some quick dough, sell the bell. Maybe, maybe not. Moving away from the leper window, that wasn't a leper window, we come to the main part of the chapel, the altar. This is why I'm urging people to visit this place. This altar is magnificent, made completely of stone. It is huge. If you go to a church now, anywhere in England, the altars will mostly be made out of wood. This gives the chapel its age. There is some rumours that this was taken from Fountains Abbey when it was dissolved by our man Henry VIII, who did some terrific things and was always a good king. Not going to do it. Not going to do it. Not going to go into Henry VIII this time. However, just looking at this beautiful altar gives you history, gives you grounding of what this place meant. There is graffiti on it as well, which is funny because we think of our past ancestors being more respectful, but oh no, we were just as naughty as we are now. At some point in its history, it was broken. You can see the crack in these photos. However, it is still beautiful. Interesting fact about medieval churches that we can still see today is the main part of the church is called the nave. This is where the normal people like you and me would stand. Pews, fairly modern. They start to appear in high medieval age, but for most of our history, we would stand in a church. No comfy seats, although you can't call them comfy. They're hard as hell. And the chants. Now, the chants is the bit where the clergy take mass. This wooden screen that you see in this photo, that separates the nave and the chants. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. In this chapel, the chants is about 90% of the chapel, which is peculiar. So one can imagine the lepers in this small area here and the rest devoted to the clergy. There's also a bricked up doorway which suggests that there was another smaller chapel known as a chantry, which could have been devoted to a local family, a noble family that would pay for prayers to be said for their ancestors and their living family. Now we look at this interesting list of masters of the hospital. The masters of the hospital were the people in charge of worship and the care of the lepers and the poors. The poors makes me sound like a Victorian businessman. The poors! They were in charge of things. The thing that I find fascinating here is the differences in names. We start with Robert in 1268. Henry III would have been king back then. Then we go to 1294, Roger de Moulton. Edward I would have been king of England back then. These names clearly still quite French. You know, the Plantagenets, very proud of their French upbringings. You've got Henry II in there. You've got King Richard, very, very French. Then we go down to 1445. Thomas Kemp. Very English. We all know the Kemp brothers. Henry VI would have been king then. Then we look at the later names and we realise the change in what would become English names more and how we would separate ourselves from the French entirely. The last object that we're going to talk about inside the chapel is a font which is found at the back of the chapel. Why does a leper chapel attached to a hospital need a font which is specifically for baptism? Are lepers getting freaky with it? Are the poors getting their swing on? No, they're not. No. This is a mortar. It was found in the 1950s near the chapel, and it's used for grinding up grain. But, of course, we found it in a field next to the chapel. Of course it's the font. But it's interesting on the eyes. It fits. Look at it. It looks like it's supposed to be there. Couple of things to say before we leave the chapel and go outside. Historians believe that this chapel was built in 1130. Now, I've struggled to research this because it's hard to know when the hospital wasn't a hospital anymore. Certainly by the 1800s, they wouldn't be treating leprosy here. The last recorded case of leprosy in England was like in the 1700s. However, most of these institutes, this is a bare guess, I could be wrong, were dissolved during the Reformation. I'm not always blaming Henry VIII, but most of the time with Britain, if it's something bad, it's Henry VIII. Now, it does have a long history. There are almshouses attached to this. There are a couple of buildings that would have been attached to this to create the hospital facility. However, it has been derelict at times. It has been a residence at times. It's indeed, people think it started its life as a residence. The the altar being just a place to pray, and people could have slept in the chapel. There is evidence as well that animals were sometimes housed in the chapel. It's one of those buildings that has such a long history and isn't very well documented. So what the people who look after this have done is amazing. The fact that we have any information at all on a building which is close to 1,000 years old is incredible. And they deserve a round of applause. Now, yes, let's clap, 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 clap. I can't hear you clapping through the video. Everybody who looks after this chapel, you're incredible. Thank you for keeping this historic building alive and connecting us to our past. Let's go a walkabout, shall we? The outside of the chapel, just as serene and magnificent as the inside. I do have to apologise. I took the pictures and filmed this during the heat wave, and England right now is dying in this heat wave. It is sticky and horrible. Anyway, not the reason. Our green and pleasant land is a shade of brown at the moment. Brown, dying grass. Imagine this surrounded by greenery and looking really pleasant. We can see by the outside there are some parts of this chapel that it goes from Saxon to Norman to all through our history. The front door that we walked through here, it has stonework from Norman. And again, it's not perfect. It's not what we see on a cathedral or a grand church. It really roots it in this age of simplicity. The building was needed, therefore we use what stone is available. We can see the bell that we spoke about earlier, how it was discovered to be wooden at some point. This tiny door, which I'm going to call a hobbit door. I tried to find information on this, but they can't ascertain what era this door is from. Tell you what, I bet you're tired of me talking at this point. Let's just do a montage of the outside, and then let's do our little outro thing. You've listened to me rabbit on too much now. The main reason to visit this site, I feel, it is so historic. It is what building can you walk in which is nearly 1,000 years old? You can see the history of our country through this chapel, and you get a sense of standing in England through these stages. Like I said, there are Saxon stones, there are Norman stones, there are things in this chapel which were there during Henry VIII, all through our history. It's a testament to how important this is to our country and how beautiful it is that we are able to keep these buildings the way that they are. And I did take my wife along to see this chapel, so and Baby Bear. Yes, Baby Bear was there. Would you like to say anything about why people should visit this chapel?
Well, I really like this chapel. I love to visit this particular location because I find it very peaceful. I feel like it is the kind of place where I want to go and sit on the grass in front of it and just take it in. It's beautiful. It's a bit like, when you visit places like Fountains Abbey or ruined churches that have no roofs and, they've long since nobody's been in them. And that there's something really beautiful and natural about them and about seeing all the stone and seeing everything sort of stripped back. It's like that, but it's got the roof on. Do you know what? It's as pulled back and natural as I think a church could ever be, and full of history, and yet you could still go in there and pull up a pew and not get wet on a rainy day. It's beautiful. I'd recommend it. I'd recommend Ripon in general. I think if you're in Yorkshire, have a wander over to Ripon and have a sit on that grass, although there is a bench. You have to sit on the grass. It's beautiful.
So, thank you for joining me on this little tour of the Chapel of Mary Magdalen and its other name, the Leper Chapel. If you are in the area, please give it a visit. It's only like a 10-minute trip, but it is really spectacular and worthy of a little visit. This has been History Laid Bare, the Bear on Tour. Thank you.